It's Anton Deck. How you doing, guys?
Thank you.
It's like watching a film, but then all of a sudden we're in a film.
Roughly 5,000 metres above sea level. To give you an idea, that's about 700 metres on top of Kilimanjaro.
Greaser cycle still going.
As they said, I am Olie Hunter Smart, and I've got a passion for adventures and travel. And I have done from a really young age, where my dad used to take my sister and I on mystery tours, as he called them. And we'd head off on a long walk or bike ride, or we'd head off and build a camp somewhere, and we'd stay there until it got too dark or cold to be out any longer. And that's kind of continued into my adulthood, really. Since then, I've used my holidays as best as I can, undertaking mini journeys and expeditions and trips. And as I've become more confident in my knowledge and my abilities, I've been pushing myself harder to do more adventurous things. I'm just going to flip into my screen now, share this with you guys. So hopefully it's going to work. So hopefully everyone can see that now. And since then, yeah, I've been to some pretty fantastic places. I've had the opportunity to spend some time in the Belizean jungle. I've lived with a family on a remote Indonesian island, as well as undertaking the journey that I'm going to be talking to you today about, walking and kayaking the length of the Amazon River. So in 2015, I traveled the entire length of the river from its most distant source high up in the Peruvian Andes to where it reaches the Atlantic Ocean and in Brazil. And I undertook it with a friend of mine, Taryn, and we planned the whole trip ourselves. And we set off in June that year, traveling over 4,000 miles fully unsupported, carrying all our gear, food, equipment, and supplies that we needed for the 4.5-month expedition. And we became the first people to travel from that source, so the most distant source, with no additional support. Now that's just shy of traveling from the river mouth all the way to Land's End. So it's a huge, huge distance. And I loved every single moment of it. And I think that's kind of become a theme, more so the longer ago the journey was. So today I'm going to be sharing some of my tips, or favorite moments, but also tips on how you can go about planning a journey like that yourself. So just a bit of background on the Amazon River. The most distant source is at the headwaters of the Rio Mintaro, which is right at the end of that yellow line. And that was where Taryn and I were going to begin our expedition. But finding the source of a river is no easy task. And we're going to walk the length of that river. It's a whitewater river, really, made up of rapids and steep descents. And having never been whitewater kayaking before, we figured it was going to be safer for us to walk that bit. And as the guys just said, yeah, that was 400 miles in itself. And then once the river starts to flatten out, we were then going to paddle along the red section, which is known as the red zone, and then join the Rio Amazonas, which is where the white line begins, where we would paddle all the way to the mouth of the Amazon. Now, we'd heard about a shepherd, Mauro, who lived near the source, and he would be able to show us where to start our journey. And so we hitched a ride out towards his house. Now, unfortunately, we didn't know where he lived. We didn't know what he looked like. We didn't have any way of contacting him, no phone number or anything like that. And nor did he know we were coming. So we just persuaded our driver, the hitch that we got out, to keep driving along the road. And we kept on asking people, and some people had heard of him, some people hadn't. And we got to the end of this dirt track, and we had arrived at his house. Annoyingly, he wasn't in when we arrived. But luckily, his neighbor said that, yeah, he was going to be back a bit later that day. So after a night of acclimatizing, we set off in search for the source. And Mauro took us up and over the hills, past all of these llamas, his llama herd, to this little rocky outcrop. And he pointed down at the ground and he mumbled something. and we didn't really understand what he'd said, but we figured that this was it. But we couldn't believe this small damp patch on the ground would eventually become the largest water source in the world. And it's really hard to believe today, but it is true. So that little damp patch, the water starts accumulating and it forms into this little stream, which you can see in the slide here. And then it flows into the lake, Lago Akakucha. And then from that point onwards, we were going to walk 400 miles, which is the equivalent distance of walking from London up to Edinburgh. And we were walking up and over the mountains and winding our way along the edge of the river. And we would go through villages and towns, only really stopping to rest and resupply. And we were carrying all our gear for the walking leg of the journey. So that included our tents, our dehydrated meals that we were eating. We had protein and snacks, clothing, camera equipment, medical kit, satellite phone, tracking device, and much, much more. So we were carrying about 40 kilos each. And in short, we had way too much kit. But we also found out we had the wrong type of kit as we lay awake throughout the night, shivering in the -5-degree conditions. Because we planned for a relatively jungle expedition, we hadn't really planned for these cold, super cold nights. And our first week saw us clambering over these tussocks. We were climbing over fences and scrambling along these boulder-covered sort of slopes that were so steep, it felt like we could topple into the ice-cold river below. And at points, the altitude was an absolute killer. It was over 4,500 meters. And it really felt like we were breathing through a straw. It was incredibly difficult to get enough oxygen into our bodies. And after a week, we reached the road, and that road would become our home, really, as we followed the Rio Montaro. And it continued to undulate its way up and down the river valley, hitting 4,000 meters another 4 times. And we reached the small village of Tinkoy, and it was a community comprised of road workers, and they were resurfacing the road down to San Francisco, which is where we'd sent our kayaks to. But there was also an army base there, and we sought permission from the army as to where we could stay. And they pointed out at a flat piece of ground just to their left that they could see. They were kind of looking over it. And they said, yeah, you can stay on that ground. And we looked over and we sort of wandered over. And the closer we got, we realized that the boulders along this flat piece of ground were sort of grapefruit sized. They were absolutely huge. And we didn't think we were going to get a very good night's sleep as it was. We moved a couple about, set up our tents and headed off into the village for dinner. And I remember clearly we had 2 dinners that night. It was a double dinner night because we were so hungry, and the food was available. And as we retreated back to our tents, suddenly 2 gunshots were fired and we froze. We had no idea what was going on. And we decided eventually we were going to retreat quickly into our tents, and we were not going to get ourselves ready for bed. We were just going to get in and keep quiet. There was no doing our teeth that night. And so we started getting ourselves ready. And it wasn't long before 3 huge army dogs turned up, and they were sniffing their way around our tents, trying to get inside. Now, Taran gave one of them a big punch straight through the side of his tent, which didn't seem to do anything. This dog was determined to get in. But eventually they did leave. But they took one of his socks as a little bit of compensation for the whack that he'd given it. And then next up, we heard some shouting, and these guys came along. And they asked us to come out of our tents. And so we clambered out, we put on our boots, and there were 4 guys, the 4 guys in this picture here. And 2 of them had these massive machine guns, and they demanded to see our passports, which we quickly produced, praying that we had the right permissions to be in this area. And they requested to see also requested to see our camera as well. And they began searching through the images to just find out what we were actually up to. And after about 10 minutes of interrogation of what we were doing, why we were there, who our contacts were, questions moved on to where we were heading. And one of the guys who spoke a reasonable level of English, actually, he'd lived in a town called Iquitos, which is somewhere where we were going to be passing through later along our journey in the kayaks. And he began recounting stories of his time growing up there before he then joined the military. And they began joking about the music and the parties that we would have when we reached there. And then the guy that was looking through my camera handed it back and complimented me on the quality of the photos that I'd been taking. And it was about an hour later, after the conversation continued to evolve, and they wished us a good night and said, make sure you drop in and say goodbye to us before you leave. And so the following morning, Taryn and I, we packed up our bags, we headed off to the army base to say a quick goodbye. It was at that point we were then invited in. We were provided with a hot coffee, which was something that was pretty rare. We just tended to get up and go. And we had a huge cooked breakfast before they then asked us for a photo with every single person on that base. And it was a real surreal experience. Now, as we neared the point where we'd start paddling, we could feel the environment change, and the heat was becoming more intense, more humid, and the air was becoming much damper. And we were finally in the jungle, which is my favorite environment to be traveling through. And a little further on, we then caught a glimpse of the river that would become our home for the next 3 months. And I really couldn't wait. We'd been walking for 5 to 6 weeks by this stage with this heavy backpack on. And it was just the thought of being able to take that off and sit down for just a little while was too much to kind of consider. So by now we'd completed the yellow section, which we'd walked, and we were about to start along the red line. But before we could begin kayaking, we had to get permission from the military and the local tribe to travel through the red zone. Now, the red zone is a tribal governed area, and it's the largest cocaine producing region in the world. There's a lot of narco traffickers there moving and shifting cocaine from the production sites around the world. So with the help of our guide, which we'd hired for a month, we were able to get the permissions that we needed, and we were soon on the water in our kayaks, and we were going to paddle the remaining 3,600 miles. Now, it's probably the right time to mention that I've never actually been kayaking before this trip, and in fact, neither of us had. So we had no idea what to expect, and our first few days saw us really, it was a steep learning curve, and it turns out the river really wasn't as flat as we'd anticipated, and we navigated our way through some rapids, and the only thing we had to bail out all the water that come in as we'd gone through these rapids was our mug that we were having our protein shakes in. And we had to quickly do that before we sort of hit the next rapid. And there's a little video clip here of after Cesar, our guide, had a run-in with one of the rapids.
So Cesar fell out the kayak in a massive rapid right in the middle there. And we literally just saw the boat flip over, everything's gone. And Cesar swam to the side and clambered up the rock.
And pretty soon we were immersed in this 5 sense experience of this sort of harsh environment that we were traveling through. And if you can just imagine these huge green trees hanging over the gentle flowing river, creating what really felt like a top-notch theme park, complete with birds tweeting and bugs buzzing in every direction. And we could smell flowers in the trees and fires burning as we floated past the villages, as well as the green water that I just sort of mentioned. And we tasted food that local tribes had collected from the rainforest. And all of the time we were being attacked by insects. It was just a magical experience. And we were blessed with glorious weather from the get-go, which certainly helped. And we got the most spectacular sunrises and sunsets on a daily basis. And I just love this photo. This duck is really appreciating the environment he's in. And it was along this stretch that things started to get pretty interesting for us, as we found out it wasn't always quite as tranquil as it seemed. At points we would hear these strange whistles and calls moving down the river. And at first I thought these were wild animals making sort of noises to each other. But all of a sudden, a man would pop out onto a sandbank further downstream and he'd call us over. So Taryn and I made our way over. And we suddenly realized the closer we got that he had a shotgun. and these were shotgun wielding Rondero. And the Rondero are a community-based security force who they just wanted to check our paperwork. But the first time this happened, it was particularly terrifying. And we didn't really know what to expect or what they were after. And Cesar, our guide, would often paddle about 500 meters behind us, so he was no use to us at all in these situations. And we'd find ourselves being marched up to the village leader as a bigger group gathered around us. And, you know, it felt very threatening, just two gringos, as they called us, surrounded by the community. And we showed the leaders our paperwork, which we'd got before we started kayaking. And luckily, they all confirmed that we did have the permissions to be in this area. And at that moment, shotguns went away and we were welcomed in for what they call Masato, and it's their welcome drink. And it's a local alcoholic drink made with fermented yucca. And the way they make it is that the women of the community start to chew the yucca root, and they then spit it out into this large pot. They add some water and then they leave it to ferment for 5 to 6 days. The longer they leave it, the more alcoholic it is. And it is absolutely disgusting. But I also learnt the hard way that if you finish it, your bowl is quickly refilled. So needless to say, the further we got through the red zone, I began slowing down how much I was slowing down my drinking and just managing to finish it as we had to leave. So by now we were through the red zone and we completed the yellow and the red lines. And we were about to start along the white line, the Rio Amazonas proper. And the river continued to widen, and at points it would reach 8 or 9 miles wide, which is further than you can actually see in a kayak. And the water really slowed down as it began to fill the valley, and it almost felt like it was flowing backwards at points. And paddling became really cathartic, and there was very little to distract us. We just had to kind of keep going. And we'd pass these fishermen that would sit out in the middle of the river in their tiny little dugout canoes, waiting for a bite. And so we would ask them if there were any tips or shortcuts that we could take. And there were often these braided streams that, that some of which contained water, some of which didn't. And so we would ask them, the best route to head further downstream. And at times they were definitely a little bit too optimistic in the volume of water still left in some of these channels, as we found we had to walk our way through them. But there was an abundance of wildlife around us, and we saw otters, we saw caiman, anacondas, pink dolphins, and we even woke up one morning to find jaguar footprints around our tent. And within a few weeks, we reached Iquitos, where we then took some time off to let our, if I'm honest, tired bodies kind of recover and to dry out, really. Bits of our bodies had begun to be plagued by rot, whether it was on our hands or on our feet, around our heels, basically anywhere that was sitting in water for long periods of time. And the rot actually really starts to smell pretty bad. So you know when you've got it, and no amount of talcum powder gets rid of it. So we just needed a couple of days to get through that. And over the border, sorry, that's a picture of Iquitos. It also gave us an opportunity to have a look at the sort of the colonial architecture of the town. And so we passed over the border and into Brazil, and we were into our longest single stretch of the river. And this was 21 days in a row of paddling, no breaks at all. And we would pass these small communities that sat along the edges of the small channels that we were taking. And we decided to try and stop in most of these to avoid sort of the Colombian pirates that we'd been warned about that came down from Colombia into Brazil. But stopping in these communities had their own problems as well. And it was whether we were cooking or whether we were washing, trying to go to sleep. We were swamped by up to sort of 50 people at a time watching our every single move. Now, Tarrant absolutely hated that. He really didn't enjoy staying in these communities and just wanted a bit of peace and quiet. I, on the other hand, quite enjoyed it. I loved the interaction with the people, but also I felt a sense of security being in these communities. And one day, as we made our way towards the urban jungle of Manaus, Tarrant and I actually got separated. and we spent the night apart. So earlier that day, we'd both stopped on the side of the river. We'd had our lunchtime break together, and we'd agreed the route for the afternoon. And at about 4:30 p.m, I began to worry that I hadn't seen him since that lunch break. And at 5:30, I pulled up into a fisherman's camp to see whether they'd seen a guy that, to be honest, looked pretty similar to me by this stage, huge beard and looking pretty scruffy. And unfortunately, they hadn't. So I made the decision. It was beginning to get dark now. I made the decision to stay put in that community for the night in the hope that I'd be able to locate him in the morning. Fortunately, with the help of my satellite phone, which I had in my kayak, and the GPS tracker that Taryn had in his, and my parents who were able to see the GPS tracking information, I set off at first light and I paddled diagonally across the river, and I found his tent perched on this little sandbank, where I was then able to wake him up and sort of questioning him on his move the previous day. And seemingly he just ploughed on, really without giving it much of a thought, that if he couldn't see me, there was no way I would be able to see him. And to my great pleasure, he had a pretty horrendous night's sleep. There'd been some gunfire at about 11 p.m, which was pretty close to his tent, and I'd heard that from the other side of the river. And so after that, he was pretty scared for the rest of the evening. But it was really worrying we'd managed to let ourselves get separated like that. And as we passed through Manaus, we were finding that the meanders we were going around, the meanders of the river, they were taking half a day or even a day to get around. And the ships that we were passing, or were passing us, were these vast ocean-going liners taking goods all the way around the globe. And as we started to near the ocean, islands started to appear in the main channel. And one evening we pulled over onto one of these islands for the night, and we set up our tents. And suddenly these two fishermen appeared kind of out of nowhere, really. And they began explaining that we couldn't stay here for the night. It was going to be too dangerous. And we sort of said, oh, don't worry about that. I'm sure we'll be okay. And they said, no, we're going to be fishing. And we were like, no, that's fine. You won't be bothering us. And then they pointed at the sandy cliff behind us, and they said, well, that cliff might collapse on your tents. And so we looked at the position of our tents and thought, well, yeah, they might be a little bit too close, but I'm sure they'd be okay just for one night. And so they began retreating back to their boat. And as they did, they pointed down at the ground and they said, "Jacare." Now, it wasn't a word that we were familiar with, never really come across it before. And so he began pacing out these 5 huge paces. And it was about 5 meters in total. And then he showed us the claw marks and the body drag marks in the sand. And then we clocked, it was caiman. And the fishermen left us, sun was beginning to set, and Taryn and I discussed our options. And we decided that actually it was going to be too late to pack up our tents, get back in our kayaks and paddle to the safety of another beach somewhere. The riverbank was 2-3 kilometers away. That would take us a good hour to get to. So we decided that if it was just one set of claw marks, we grab a stick out of that big pile of washed up debris in the background of the photo there, and we put that near our tents. And we then put on the water to boil for our evening meal. And I actually took a wash in the shallows, and I used my mug just to rinse down with. And as I was coming out of the water, I suddenly looked to my left and I could see just hundreds of these claw marks, both up and down the beach. This wasn't just one caiman. This is where all of the caiman came. We had to make a pretty quick decision, and we scrambled up that cliff that you can see in the background there with our tents, and hoped that they wouldn't be able to follow us. Now, I've since learned that caiman can actually climb some pretty steep angles up to sort of almost vertical. So I'm not sure we were 100% safe, but we got through that evening. So by now the vegetation had begun to change, and it made it much harder for us to find places to stay. It transferred into sort of mangrove and swamp areas. But there was also an increased risk of pirates in these areas, hiding amongst the tree roots. And in the narrow channels, as we pass through this area, we were asked if we had a gun to protect ourselves. Now, luckily, we never actually needed one, but one evening along this stretch, we heard a load of screaming and shouting, and a villager came up to us and told us to turn off our head torches. And we sat there on this jetty, dinner in hand, and we watched as this flatbed container ship was robbed right in front of our eyes. I mean, we were so lucky, but it was a real awakener as to how lucky we'd actually been. So nearing the end of the channel, we started to feel the influence of the tide, and we battled for hours against the wind and the waves, moving forward only a couple of kilometers before we then had to find a place to stop. And so we then had to change our schedule. So it became a 24-hour schedule. So we were doing 6 hours on, 6 hours off, and then just repeating that. And in our 6 hours off, we tried to get as much sleep as we could, but we were only really surviving on sort of maybe 3-4 hours at a time. And we were paddling through the moonlight, through the night, guided by that moonlight. And it was really tough 7 days. And the further we got out towards the river mouth, the places that we were trying to stop became further and further apart. And on our last night, we got up at about 10:30 in the evening, and we put some dehydrated food in our kayaks and packed them up, and off we set. And we stepped into them for what we hoped was going to be our last time. And we paddled through the clear night sky. We were guided by that moonlight. And as the sun rose, we really weren't far from the headland, where we would then make our way out into the Atlantic. And all of a sudden, the tide changed, and we were nowhere near as far out as we needed to be. But it was so strong. So we ended up having to pull into the mangroves just to hold on to these trees and wait for the sort of 6 hours before the tide turned again. So I thought, great, I'll have my breakfast now. And I opened up my porridge, and by this stage I was running low on fresh water. So I decided to use the salt water, the seawater, thinking it would be okay. And I took one bite of this cold porridge, and I just gagged. There was so much salt in this water that there was no way I could contemplate even eating this. I was just going to have to go hungry. 6 hours later, we finally got out of the mangrove, and we were determined to make that the final push. And on the outgoing tide, it actually didn't take that long to reach the headland, where we then followed a line of fishing boats that were heading out into the Atlantic Ocean. And they were bouncing around like pinballs. It was unbelievable, with these huge waves, sort of 15-foot walls of water towering over us. And 8 miles out, we finally reached what we considered our destination. And that meant that basically the next piece of land to the west was the African coastline. So after 131 days, our mammoth expedition was finally over. Now, it might sound pretty daunting to say you're going to follow the length of a river or walk the length of a country, and it really doesn't need to be. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I went about planning that expedition, and this applies for kind of every expedition, no matter how big or small you're looking to do. And I remember a time between this expedition, I went back to work, and I quit my job again to then plan my walk the length of India. And I spent the first 3 days just sitting there, not really knowing what I needed to be doing. And I became really frustrated with myself and wondering whether I'd made a huge mistake by quitting my job and thinking I could do a journey like this again. But slowly but surely, I began to sort of remember some of the things that we'd done previously. And my top tip is really to write a list. And this is a list of all the things that you need to do in order to get yourself from this moment in time to the start line. And that includes how you're physically going to get yourself there. So looking at flights or trains, that sort of thing. Looking at the permits that you need. So whether you need a visa for the country you're traveling to, or whether you need special permission from the military or anyone else. I then look at my approximate route, roughly where I want to go, and that will be based on the purpose of the expedition. And I'll look into things like where I might be staying, and whether that's in a tent or whether I can rely on communities or accommodation along the route. I think about what I'm going to be eating, particularly if I'm going through a remote environment where I can't rely on being able to restock with local resources and supplies. I need to be able to carry all of that with me. I look at what support I might need, so guides, porters, whether that might give me some support that I want. And then I think about all of the kit and equipment. And each of these is just like my to-do list. And I begin doing more research into every single item on that list. And the more research I do, the more prepared I feel, and I start making decisions and narrowing things down until a point where I sort of feel like I've done a decent level of planning. I also start talking to people as well. So I'll reach out to people that have done similar journeys, similar expeditions, and I tell them a bit about my plans. And I ask them how they would change their trips or some of the top pieces of kit they might have taken with them. I start reaching out to people that maybe know the areas that I'll be traveling through, particularly if it's a remote area. I speak to experts, I speak to local travel companies, and I just try and build up a sense of what it will be like for me to do something like that. And I also tell my friends and family, you know, and just by doing that, you can ask them if they can help you in some way. And that might just be an introduction to someone that can then help you in a more meaningful way. But that introduction might be the key to the success of your expedition. And I find that the more people I tell, the more likely it is I'm going to be doing the journey, because there's no way of backing out once you've told that many people. It's sort of public knowledge by that stage. Now, the next kind of thing I think about is my safety. So using a guide is a great way to ensure your safety. And I used a guide on my journey through India and a little bit on part of the Amazon. And the great thing about a guide is you get some local knowledge. Now, the reason I hired a guide in India was to help me through the mountain trails that I was going to be taking. But also they can help me with things like language as well. The next top tip, I think, is taking a copy of your passport. Now, I always carry a copy of my passport on my body, but I also save a copy of that on Google Drive as well, which means that if your passport gets lost or damaged or stolen, then at least you can print out another copy and you can show the authorities when you need to and kind of explain the situation. But you've got a copy that you can access pretty much anywhere in the world. There's also health information that you might want to consider. So this device is called a Vagaband, and it's just a little wristband that unrolls, and you're able to write your personal health information on there. So if you say, for example, you're allergic to penicillin, you can mark that down on this little wristband. And the great thing about these are customized to individual countries. So you can get one for India. If you can't speak the language, but you've ticked the box that says, yeah, I'm allergic to penicillin, then you can show that, and it's automatically got the Hindu translation, for example. So a great little idea that. Now, the third thing is insurance. Travel insurance can be a minefield, so it's worth looking into this properly. But you need to really look into the sort of the small print, but what activities you're going to be covered for. Some will cover you up to 4,500 meters altitude hiking as standard. Some will cover you up to 6,000 meters. So just make sure that's covered. You know, and the price difference between the policies is very negligible. For the Amazon trip, I actually ended up with 2 travel insurance policies, one for the walking leg of the journey and one for the kayaking leg, because the policy would cover me as kind of standard for each of those. Now there's kit. There is so much kit that you could take out there, different pieces of kit for kind of every eventuality, but you've got to be sensible about it. And don't forget, you've got to be carrying it. So you just need to work out what you're going to need. And my tip is really to keep it slim. Pack, and then repack. And each time remove bits that maybe not an everyday item or you don't have more than one use for. The next thing I always do is I pack everything in dry bags. This is an example of one of the dry bags I use. It actually had a hole in. But it allows you to compartmentalize your backpack or your luggage into particular sections. So if you only need, you know, your change of clothes and your wash kit for one night, you only need to get 2 bags out. It makes it super simple. But also, obviously, if your bag gets wet, then at least all your kit is going to stay dry. Now, moving on to clothing, you only really need 2 sets of clothing, one set for the daytime, one set for the nighttime. So my nighttime set of clothing is that size. You don't need any more than that. Electronics, again, whack them all in a dry bag, and try and use USB chargers where possible. But if you can get this is the UK version, obviously, but if you can get the European version or the American version, that saves on a little bit of bulk as well. And then just try and double up on chargers and cables where you possibly can. And then if you're changing environments, try and send yourself a package to access that further along the route. You know, that will help cut down your weight. It means you won't have to carry about it. You almost don't need to think about it. And then I guess finally, the last thing to say is, you know, stay safe and healthy. I use these water to go drink filters, water filters. And the great thing is that they've got this filter which filters as you're drinking. So it'll filter out any sediment, any bacteria, bugs, viruses, but also heavy metals and potential pollution in the water itself.
Cool. So that was Olie Hunter Smart's The Road to Independence after he walked the length of India. That is absolutely unbelievable. Ollie's with us now. Olie, how are you? All right?
Yeah, I'm all good, thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed watching that again. I haven't seen it for quite a while, so it brought back a lot of memories.
Oh, really? Yeah, I bet. I've got no doubt, yeah. So, guys, we've got a lot of your photos coming up in the stream. So keep those, sorry, not photos, questions coming up in the stream. So keep those questions coming. We'll try and get through as many as we can. I'll kick off just one of my own, really. Then we can go from there. Olie, I mean, to do something like that is an unbelievable challenge, just the walking. To add the filming it yourself to that, just how much like a mental challenge is it to, you know, I guess continue with the filming, even when you must be like, I just don't want to be doing that. That's the last thing I want to be doing is whipping out that camera and doing that at this moment in time. Yeah,
I mean, the way, the process of going about making a film about while you're walking, you do have to set up a tripod. You walk one direction. You maybe, if you want a particularly wide shot where you've got nice big valley in the background or whatever, you may then have to, like that shot may take 15, 20 minutes, maybe even up to an hour to capture, because you've got to set the camera up, go back, walk through the screen, walk back again, go and pick up the camera, you know, and if anything's happened, quite often I would set the camera up, I'd walk away from it, and then I'd find a load of kids just facing the camera and waving at it, and I was just like, oh no, I'm going to have to do that again. So that I mean, that happened quite frequently. But yeah, I think if you're going to film an adventure, partly that is the reason you go to do the adventure. You know, it really does detract from the actual expedition itself, you know, just going through the walk and so on. But you have to be 100% committed to it, because you could come back and you haven't necessarily got the right shots, and then you get into an edit suite, even if you're doing it at home, and you think, oh, do you know what, I wish I'd filmed that in a different way, or I wish I had captured that piece that I couldn't be bothered to recapture.
Yeah.
And there's so many times that happened, and you just sort of think, I'll find another time to capture it, and you never do. So
yeah,
to the filmmaking side of it.
Yeah, I bet. Actually, Gemma here on the feed has said, how did you balance being like in the moment, but also being able to capture the moment? It's kind of it's a hard thing to do, right? Is it really kind of having to sort of act and sort of try and reenact that moment rather than act, but try and make it happen again? Or how do you do that?
There are points where you do try and reenact something. Often they don't come across very well, because you know, you only really get a natural reaction that first time, and if you haven't captured it, then you're not going to be able to recreate it very easily unless they're a very skilled actor. And the same with me, you know, I'm not a skilled actor in any way, shape or form, and so even for me to try and reenact something is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, there are times where you know that you've missed that opportunity, and you just kind of have to think, well, do you know what, I'm just going to leave it. and forget about it and move on, and something else will come up. You know, I was on the road for 7.5 months, so there were a lot of other opportunities that did present themselves, you know, and that what you've just seen is an hour snapshot of my 7.5 months through India. There is so much footage I haven't even seen yet. You know, I had to piece this together pretty quickly for the Adventure Travel Film Festival. So that, yeah, I didn't go through it, all of my clips. I'm sure there's, you know, some really nice bits in there, but at the same time, there are probably tons of really rubbish shots that are no use to anyone.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's so cool. So let's talk a bit about the sort of the Gandhi sort of side of it. It was quite a big theme of the whole film, really, sort of walking in Gandhi's footsteps, if you like. Was that always the intention right at the beginning before you even left? Is it something you sort of stumbled across as you were sort of getting into learning more about India as you were going, or how did it all sort of come about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was traveling to work one day in London, and I was reading Shortlist magazine. I don't even know if that still exists, but it had a list of the top 10 protests that had changed something in the world significantly, and the Salt March was on there, but it wasn't something I'd come across. I hadn't really come across peaceful protests before I'd read about the Salt March, and obviously they've become much more popular with the environmental movement and all of that. And yeah, I just read that article and thought that'd be really cool to retrace Gandhi's Salt March, you know, that 240-mile route down the coast of India. And the more research I did into that, I realized how significant that walk had been on the independence movement and the protests that happened. And I thought, you know what, I've actually got to go and find out a bit more about the history of India. And while I was doing that research, I really discovered that there were very few accounts from Indian people that actually experienced it. And I thought, do you know what, I want to go and find out what it was actually like to live through that era. You know, what was it like as a small child to have to leave your home, move somewhere else to a completely new place? You had no idea where you were going, when you were ever going to reach your kind of destination. And I wanted to hear some of those first-hand accounts. And because partition happened, well, 73 years ago now, I kind of thought if I wanted to hear those first-hand accounts, I would have to travel very soon. So I planned it pretty quickly, and off I went.
Yeah, it's amazing, man. And the sheer scale of it is something that gets me, that just quite how massive it really was, and the challenge side of it. I mean, we had a question come up here: is when did you think I'm going to throw the towel in? Because there must have been moments where you thought, actually, you know, what am I? Because especially when it's something like this, you've thought the idea up on your own, you've gone there on your own, you're filming it on your own. You must at some point think, Ollie, are you nuts? Like, what am I doing out here all on your own, this massive challenge? And how did you keep going?
I mean, I do think there's probably a screw loose up there somewhere, but I think, you know, the first 5 weeks I had the guide and the porters with me, and then I had about a week on my own, and then I got really ill. And that was when I got the food poisoning for the first time. And then I did manage to get myself back on the road. I got some antibiotics and started moving again. But after I'd had that first kind of issue, it began to go over in my mind as to whether I could actually continue walking like this. You know, I'd had so many problems. I'd had the food poisoning. I'd had issues with my bag on day one, you know, all the way through the mountains there. And then I'd got those massive blisters as well underneath my toenails, which that was really the straw that almost broke me. And I took a day off and I rested, and I said, right, to be honest, I put myself in this situation. I was the one that came up with this idea, and it's something I am interested in. If I continue to walk and push myself until, you know, 3 days later, the Sunday, and if I hadn't met someone that was interesting, or hadn't laughed or smiled at something, then I can rethink how I'm walking or traveling. And, you know, inevitably, you know, in a couple of hours on the road, and I'm sure you guys had a very similar experience, you know, you see something hilarious and you just wetting yourself on the side of the road. And you think, how is that a thing?
Yeah.
And it's those kind of things that kind of kept me going. And I just, once I was out the mountains, if I'm honest, it did become a lot easier. I think just mentally, I found it much easier until I'd got down towards Mumbai, and that was where I spent the best part of 3 months walking through the flat plains of India. And there was no texture in the landscape. There was kind of nothing to look at, nothing to judge my sense of scale, how far I'd been going each day. And that was actually really demotivating. And yeah, I think once I got down to Mumbai, I kind of knew I'd got it in the bag, pretty much, even though I had like 1,000 kilometers to go.
Nice. Only 1,000. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you say though, because you're quite right. You had kind of like, I think your any sort of trip, you kind of have a moment when you're getting into it, you're sort of getting your feelers for it. At some point in that first sort of instance, there is that sort of feeling where that can be sort of the hardest sort of part, sort of coming to terms with it and that sort of stuff, and getting the sort of mentality right and that sort of stuff. So that's really quite cool. Well, I know what you mean. What about the planning then? Because someone's asked here about how does it take to plan something like that. You mentioned obviously about the research and that sort of stuff. When compared to when did you think the idea up and when do you actually leave? How does it take you?
So the idea came about in 2015, I think it was. But I was actually doing my journey down the Amazon in 2015, and so I kind of went off, did that trip, came back, did some talks, that sort of thing, went back to work. And I kind of had an inkling as to when I was going to do it. But I didn't actually start planning that trip. I spoke to a couple of people about it and they said, you should really go ahead and do it if you're going to do it. And I quit my job in December, and my initial plan was to leave in February. So I was going to give myself like 2.5 months of planning. And in India, you can get a 6-month visa, or you can get a 12-month visa, but you have to have a break in the middle and you have to leave the country and then go back in, as I'm sure you guys know. And so I thought, well, if I leave in February, I can then get down to the southern tip in time for Independence Day. I hadn't really thought about climate and conditions and all that sort of thing. And I'd found a fixer who was going to help source a guide. And he said, there is no way you can start up in the Himalayas in February. You could do it bottom to top and finish in the mountains in sort of October time. That'd be easy enough, or August time. But there's no way you can go south. And so I had to shift to start in end of April, which then meant there was no way I was going to hit Independence Day at the southern tip, which actually, to be honest, was a blessing in disguise, because it did take me more than 6 months. And it meant that I could actually, enjoy it, and I could stop at places where I wanted to. And if I randomly met someone that was particularly interesting, I could stay with them, for a night or two. So it did give me that element of flexibility. So I still think the planning stage took me about 2 months to map out my route, do my research and where I was going to stay and that sort of thing. I also improved my filmmaking skills. So I spent probably 2 months worth of time doing that. So I was learning a lot more about the types of shots I needed, how to construct a story, getting the wide shots, the tight shots, all of that sort of stuff. Which obviously made me far more efficient once I was on the ground. But I'm going to be honest, I was not efficient once I was out there. When you're tired and hungry, and you think, oh, do I really want to get the camera out? And you do a bit of a half-hearted effort, and then you look back at it and think, I didn't put the effort in, and therefore I haven't got the shots to make that into part of the story.
Yeah, we definitely know all about that, mate. Yeah, for sure. So, Olie, tell us about India, because we heard a lot yesterday from you about the Amazon, your Amazon trip, and I'm just quite interested personally to hear, how did it compare the two places and the two different kinds of challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two totally different things, although obviously I did a walking element to both of them. One of the reasons why I did India solo was to really find out how I would cope being kind of on my own and isolated for long periods of time. and it is a fascinating process to go through. Just spending your own time with your own thoughts and processes and stuff. And I would say that was, you know, one of the reasons I did it solo. The other reason is because I had this objective of making the film and looking at the history of independence and how it affected people. I didn't want someone else to come in sort of partway through my planning stage and then kind of impact that story and that narrative that I wanted to kind of communicate in the film.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, you know, in all honesty, at no point in my journey through India did I feel alone. There were always people around, and in fact, at times it is so it's such an intense country. It's an assault on all of your senses the whole time, and it's really difficult to kind of escape it. And there were times where I got to a hotel and I closed the door, and even then people would knock on the door and say, can I speak English with you? And I'm just like, no. So I never felt alone. I think the mental side of things, it does become harder when you haven't got someone else kind of motivating you and to pick you up when you're feeling down. And I know that my parents and friends that I was kind of in touch with over WhatsApp sort of really helped me with that. But and again, I guess another kind of contrasting aspect is the fact that the Amazon was very much wilderness, wild environment. India is such a populated country. You know, if I ever needed any help with anything, there was a man there to be able to do it. You know, there was one time when I was walking through the rain, and it had probably been raining all afternoon. And I got to this little village, and there were some people just sheltering underneath their house, you know, sort of outside the veranda. And I just walked up to them and I said, you know, can I get out of the rain for just 5 minutes? And it was all done through sign language because I didn't speak Hindi. They didn't speak English. And I don't even think they spoke Hindi. I think they spoke the state language. And they let me in. And then, you know, inevitably half an hour later, I was still sat there. And then they came out with a plate of food, and they eventually made me a bed, you know, and it was times like that that I think it was advantageous to be on my own, because I don't think that would have necessarily happened if there were two of us. And as I say, like, you know, people went out of their way to really help me.
Yeah. Awesome. So in terms of the film, you know, you mentioned the sort of people and sort of helping you and that sort of stuff. How do you, I mean, essentially when you meet most people, they're complete strangers, and you're trying to do a documentary at the same time. How do you sort of approach that sort of barrier of filming strangers and capturing their sort of you know, their reactions to you and that sort of stuff? Was it sort of thing you just put the camera up and sort of hope they're okay with it, or sort of ask? And how do you, if so, how did you approach that in the first place?
I think it's a really tricky one. Obviously, if I was doing an interview with someone, I would either have approached them in advance, and some people I did. I sent them an email even before I left the UK. Actually, some of them, sort of history professors and that sort of thing. I'd actually approached them before I left, so they were kind of aware that I was making a film and what I wanted to get out of it. Other people, I would spend, you know, maybe half an hour to an hour having a conversation with them, kind of warming up. To then, you know, get a few of their stories, and then I'd sort of say, actually, do you mind if I film this? And I already will have said, you know, they will have seen the camera anyway and the tripod, because I always carried those in my hands to make sure I captured everything. And so I would just say, actually, do you mind if I could film this? And they'd either say no, and I think I only had one person that said no. Everyone else was like, yeah, okay, that's fine. But to your point, it's very difficult to capture that, you know, the story in the same way that they told it the first time. They would have maybe changed it slightly or didn't understand my question to then, you know, come out with the same story. It was very hard to capture first reactions, initial reactions from people. So I think, you know, that's something I was very conscious of. You know, when I was walking, I would walk through a village, and people would kind of stop. They would stare at me. They'd watch me walking through, and about 30 meters down the road, they would then start shouting something, almost, you know, hey, hey, hey. And it was always interesting kind of seeing how that worked. You know, they were almost stunned for 30 seconds. And then suddenly they thought, oh, wait a minute, I want to have a conversation with that guy. And I could never capture that on my own, because as soon as they'd seen the camera, they would have approached me and, you know.
Yeah,
It's
makes a lot of sense.
just approaching people. I gave the camera to people sometimes and said, can you film me, you know, doing this, or particularly in markets, that sort of thing. You quite often get a very shaky camera, but sometimes you got someone that kind of understood, particularly if you gave your phone to them. They kind of got the concept of holding a phone still, whereas a video camera, they didn't, and you know, quite a lot of those shots weren't usable.
There you go. So yeah, interesting, man. So we haven't got too much time left for too many more questions, but I think everybody is dying to know, how are your feet and did your toenails grow back? Because,
My feet, yeah, no, my feet recovered. To be honest, by the time I got down to the very southern tip of India, I'd lost that toenail and it started regrowing, which is good. I didn't get any blisters at all once I was out of the mountains,
wow.
which is, yeah, really interesting. It's obviously, you know, the way the boots were fitting my feet, and as the climate changed, my feet expanded. And then once I got to Delhi, I actually changed walking boots to a new set, and I think they're desert boots, so they're kind of more breathable and gave me much more kind of didn't give me any problems at all. So yeah, they're good.
Your feet are okay. That's good news. And have you got any plans to use them on any more future expeditions? Any crazy long walks or anything? But what's in the future?
So the boots that I took through the mountains have since walked across Hadrian's Wall. I did that in January this year. So that was a really cool little trip. Again, I got blisters. I set off with no kind of zero preparation, physical preparation anyway. Yeah, so they've been around. The desert boots, they're done. They are totally shot. They kind of started tearing in the monsoon rain and stuff. And then, do I have any ideas about what I'm going to do next? Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed making the film, and my plan is to continue kind of doing that sort of thing.
Cool.
I've got a couple of ideas. Obviously, we're all in lockdown, and I'm not quite sure when or how I might be able to go about it. But yeah, we'll see.
Oh, future stuff under wraps, close to the chest. I can't wait to find out what it is, and hopefully, yeah, we can see the films in the future. Well, that was Olie Hunter Smart's adventure and his kayaking, and then the Q&A, obviously, after we played The Road to Independence, his film about walking the length of India. Exciting stuff, crazy adventures. He really gets up to some pretty out there challenges, doesn't he, mate?
He does indeed, mate. Yeah, absolutely. I remember at the Armchair Festival when he said he, you know, just started kayaking down the Amazon, first with a kayak, blew people's minds, mine included, actually. So yeah, it's really going in the deep end, you could say. And obviously there we had the quick Q&A after his film as well, The Road to Independence. And obviously if you haven't seen The Road to Independence, but you've seen the Q&A and now you think you might like to see it, you can obviously find it online, Vimeo, The Road to Independence, Olie Hunter Smart, cracking film, really, really, really worth watching. Yeah, I enjoyed that. I really did.
Yeah, it was a good one, mate. So we'll post the Vimeo link in the description here. Who we got next week?
Sam Manicum, actually. Sam
Manicum.
Doesn't need much for an introduction, but for those of you who don't know who he is, Sam Manicum, 8 years around the world, 200,000 miles by motorbike. He's a bit of a legend of the sort of overlanding scene, if you like. And he did a cracking Q&A with Graham Hoskins of Adventure Bike TV. So it might also be of more interest to people, because Graham did a wonderful job, and it was a nice break from us. So, you know,
yeah, it was. Yeah,
that's a good thing, really. So
yeah, good guy, Graham, as well. They're all good guys and girls at Adventure Bike TV. It's a good TV series, mate. Have you watched it?
I've watched a bit. Yeah, I enjoy it, actually. Yeah. Fun guys. Amazon Prime. So yeah, it's
It's free on Prime, mate, if you've got Prime, so it's well worth having a look. I think they've just dropped another episode, actually. I'm going to watch it tonight.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'm out tonight. You have to let me know how it goes. Obviously,
Not enough sidecars on there, though.
No, but what is most important, mate, is obviously that we're saying you can watch Sam Malcolm next week. You can actually watch it right now, become a patron, which is really exciting because we've now dropped the amount to $1 a month to get all Armchair Adventure content a week in advance, extra bonus content, and all Armchair Adventure news in advance. We're talking speakers of the next event, films of the next film night.
It's for $1 a month as well. So we're no longer talking about a cup of coffee a month. We're talking about the froth on the top of a cup of coffee a month. That's what it is, mate. You can't buy a cup of coffee for that these days.
No.
So I think it's a good idea, personally. It's still very much, you don't get much in return, but there's news there and there'll be a conversation. And I think this week, mate, we're going to drop the news of who's going to be coming to the festival, one of the people.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Let's do that.
Yeah, all right. And some may think, mate, that this next festival, one of the most exciting bits of news, is, sponsors and that sort of thing. I can confirm now that we aren't sponsored by Shaw, the deodorant brand. That is just mere coincidence that it's in the background. I do apologise. So.
Yeah. But if you're from Shaw and you're watching, or even Right Guide for that matter, pick up the contract. It's yours. Sponsorship deals there.
We've always wanted a deodorant sponsorship. So.
Always been looking for a deodorant sponsorship deal. So we've probably got
fresh
shots of... What?
We like to keep things fresh, don't we, you could say.
Nice, mate. What we like to do is mask our bad smell.
Yeah. Cheers, guys. Next week, Sam Malcolm.
Next week, Sam.